I'm James, and this is Producing Fun, a podcast about making games from a product perspective. Welcome to Producing Fun. This week I talked to two guests, Jackson Pope and Paul Willcox, who together run indie games publisher Eurydice Games, known for its space battling dexterity game, Flick Fleet. But Eurydice Games isn't just a publishing house. Jack and Paul take the hands-on indie approach to a whole new level, actually manufacturing their own games by hand. In the early days of their company, this even extended to making game boxes from scratch, and it still involves Paul spending countless hours over a laser cutting machine, cutting plastic spaceships and engraving them with exquisite decals. Eurydice isn't Jack's first venture. In the late noughties, he also ran another company, Riva Games, but his experience there led him to take a completely different, more cautious approach this time. Instead of big print runs, he would, with Paul, produce limited quantities of games entirely by the sweat of their own brow, allowing them to do something with Flick Fleet that would otherwise have required huge investments in tooling for plastics. Jack and Paul's unique model gives them an unusually comprehensive appreciation of how the cost of labour, manufacturing methods, and component choices interact. So it's no surprise that this conversation itself is full of interesting insight, from the ups and downs of large print runs to how they make the most of their small-scale processes to do things that wouldn't be possible for others, and their tips for manufacturing your own games and prototypes. If you like the idea of physically making your own games, or simply want to understand the critical details and forces that affect how they're made, this is well worth your time. We join, just as I've asked Jack why on earth, with all the other work publishers have to do, he wants the responsibility of manufacturing his own games as well.
This story starts a long time ago. So I've always been interested in designing games, and I started out designing computer games, but I was making tiny bits of computer games in my spare time around a full-time job. And I was making, like, you can make a little man walk around a landscape, but there's no scenery and you can't really do anything. It's such a tiny percentage of an actual game that it was a bit of a waste of time, really. I enjoyed doing it, but I wasn't really getting anywhere. Then I played Mighty Empires for a weekend with some mates. And when I say for a weekend, it took 36 hours. We played it over 3 days, breaking for meals and sleep. And I thought, well, that was fun, but it was a bit mental because I think after about something like 27 hours, some random event wiped out the guy who was winning the game. And so all of a sudden he went from being winning to losing by a country mile. I thought, this is too random and it takes way too long. Nobody's got 27 hours for a game. I bet I could design a game that's a bit like this, but plays quicker. And that led to Border Reavers, which was my first game. And coincidentally, meeting Paul. So I designed that over a couple of years while we lived in Newcastle. Then my wife and I moved to York. It sat unloved in a Tupperware box on a shelf. And then I thought, no, this is silly. I've made it. I might as well finish it off. But I had no money, and I was pretty sure that it would be pretty niche. And we'd known some people when I lived in Bristol earlier who had a flat that was literally rammed full of board game boxes. They designed a game called the Buntu Circus, and they had, I'm going to guess, 700 or 800 board game boxes in every corner of their flat. I didn't want to be that guy. So I thought, well, I could probably make 100 copies. It would take a long time. It'd be hard work, but I reckon I could make, and might even be able to sell 100 copies. So I contacted the local games club, said, I've designed this game. I'd like to do a play testing session in a local pub. Just invite anyone who wants to come along. And one of the attendees was Paul, who I'd never met before, and a couple of his mates from his weekly games night. That went pretty well. I took several orders on the night for something that was still in development, including one for Paul. Thanks, Paul. And Paul invited me to his weekly games night. So then I started. So for the next, I guess, 3.5, 4 years, I was going to Paul's house twice a week to play games with him and his mates. During that first year of the company, I made 100 copies of Border Reavers by hand. Each one took 3 hours. They were like 2 mil thick tiles. There were a deck of cards that I cut out of a sheet of A3 paper. all sorts of other crazy things. And I sold all of those within a year. During that year, somebody sent me a game design, and I made 300 copies of that by hand as well. Although I did cheat a bit towards the end when I got some boxes made for me, because the box making was the most complex bit and time was tight. So each one of those took about an hour and a half to make. And after their boxes were made for me, I got it down to about an hour and 10 minutes. And then ended up in the slightly bizarre position of getting to spend my life insurance money, because we'd got life insurance when we bought our first flat in New York, a tiny little one-bed flat that was full of board games. And I was diagnosed with MS. And so my life insurance paid out, which was obviously bad. But I was in a position to be able to spend my life insurance without having to pretend to be somebody else and live on an island somewhere. So we paid off most of the mortgage. I invested some money in the company. I put some money aside to live on. And for the next 2 years, I was technically, not really, a professional publisher. So I got games manufactured in a factory in the UK and Germany. I sold through 21 distributors on 3 different continents. I was in retail, and then the 2009 financial crash happened. And after 2 years, I wound the company up, losing a chunk of that investment, having paid myself no salary for 2 years, and said, right, that's it. I'm terrible at this. I'm never going to do it again. And then about 3 months later, started designing a new game. And then I came up with another game in 2013, which eventually saw the light of day with the birth of my second company, Eurydice Games, in 2017. Having failed once, what I really didn't want to do was repeat my mistakes. So I said, right, that's it. I'm not going to do retail. I'm not going to do Kickstarter. I'm just going to make handmade games and sell them through my website. And I started doing that. And probably halfway through that first year, Paul and his family had come up to visit us for the weekend, and we were wandering around Cragside, which is a really cool place in Northumberland. And Paul had the idea of a game that was like X-Wing minis crossed with Flickerman. So it was the space battles from X-Wing minis, but instead of the complicated setup and then the little movement sticks and all of that kind of stuff, you just flick things. And it sounded like a really cool idea. So we looked into doing it. I knocked up a prototype using, I can actually see it from here, some 8mm MDF food from a kid's kitchen. So it was like, there was a wing of slices of pepper coming up one side. There was burgers attacking on the right, slices of bread in the middle. The dashboards, which had all the ship systems, were scribbled on bits of paper. And that first game with my brother-in-law was really good fun.
Hang on, this is a food-based prototype.
Yes, there was a leap of faith. You had to imagine that the ring of pepper over on the right-hand side was a wing of fighters, and the burger coming down the left flank was actually a giant spaceship. And that worked really well. It was surprisingly well. So over the next probably only 9 months or so, Paul and I bounced ideas off each other over email. Every time we met up, we'd try out a new version. I can't remember whose idea it was to laser cut the ships out of acrylic. Probably Paul's. He has all those kind of really cool ideas. But one of my friends had access to a laser cutter, so I drew up some files, sent them to him, gave him a pint. And so we got a prototype that actually looked like the right kind of thing. And it just developed really, really quickly. And then at that point, Paul came on board and we started a limited company. But we were in a weird position because what we needed to do, because it's got loads of different acrylic pieces, we wanted to keep it like that. We thought that the prototype we had looked really cool. We had 2 options, basically, injection molding or laser cutting. We didn't have a laser cutter. And injection molding, the setup costs are enormous. I mean, we were quoted something like, I think it was £6,000 for the molds. Then you have to pay for the pieces. The pieces are really cheap after that, but you've got to buy the mold. So to make it in such a way that it was profitable, we would have to make probably somewhere around 2,000, 2,500 copies. And I didn't want to be the guy with a house full of board game boxes, especially as I've now got 2 kids At this point, I think my youngest daughter was like a baby. So the last thing you need is a baby in a house full of board games. It would be utter disaster. So we went back on another of the things I said I would never do, and we went to Kickstarter with the intent of buying a laser cutter so that we could make a small print run. And we worked out that it'd be possible to make a run of 200 copies. As it was, I think we had like nearly 300 backers and had made 400 copies. And then when we went back to Kickstarter the second time, we did another print run, I think, of another 400 copies and a 400 copy expansion. And then during COVID times, we did a couple of crazy little Kickstarters that really blew up. They're not the $12 million worth of exploding kittens or whatever, but by our token, they were huge. The first one was like June 2020. And we're like, is this going to work? This is crazy. I don't think anyone's going to go for it. And so we set ourselves a target of 500 quid, which in hindsight was ridiculously low, but we were genuinely completely, is this going to fund or not?
I remember the conversation where we thought, that feels like a lot.
£500 target.
Are we setting ourselves up? Yeah, we really weren't sure about it at all.
As it turned out, we funded in, I think, just under an hour and ended up raising £19,000. And then the second one, we thought, right, well, that was clearly taking the piss. So we'll set ourselves a target of £1,000. I mean, maybe we should get that funded in 7 minutes and raised £32,000.
Oh, wow.
So each of our Kickstarters has been bigger than the last. Each of our financial years as a publisher has been bigger than the last by an average of like something crazy. It's like 70% or something. And we are in our 5th financial year now. So we've been going for a while. That's probably the thing I'm most proudest of, having run a company that failed spectacularly. And I think most companies do fail within 5 years. I mean, the stats are like terrible. We're approaching the end of our 5th financial year and we've been growing really, really well each year. It's been amazing.
I think it's been interesting, though, because the decision to manufacture it ourselves, we're both control enthusiasts.
Control enthusiast. Oh, I like that.
He's being polite. He's a control enthusiast. I'm a control freak.
Just say you've got a good sideline in PR there. I can see the marketing success here already. Yeah, absolutely.
But I remember there was because, as like Jack said, realistically, our 2 options to manufacture Flick Fleet were we laser cut acrylic. When we looked into the costs of having other people do that, it's ridiculous because it's such a niche thing. So. And I thought, well, it's not something we've ever done, but Jack knows someone who does this. So if we bought a laser cutter, we could maybe do it ourselves. I'm sure we could learn. But the alternative, like Jack said, of going down the injection molding route, that felt worse because there's so many unknowns. You're very reliant on those molds being exactly how you want them. And we were, I don't know, it did feel out of our control at that point. So I think,
we would have had to have raised at least, I think, like 15,000 on that first campaign, if not more.
Yeah, because it has a knock-on effect on, therefore, how many sets of the dashboards and rule books do we need to print? How many sets of all the wooden pieces do we need? The bags to put them in, the boxes. I mean, in the first edition, Jack handmade all the boxes, which, looking back, insane. We would not do that now.
Paul did help towards the end. Thank you.
That's fine. I remember cutting out the what were they, vinyl stickers effectively, weren't they, to wrap around the boxes? Yeah. And they blunted knife blades at a ludicrous rate.
Oh wow.
The decision was made out of our desire to control the process and quality assure the output, but we were also conditioned by the economy of scale and that we could afford to make smaller print runs if we did it ourselves. And I think when we moved into the second edition, the expansion, we jettisoned making boxes ourselves because it was just too time consuming for both of us, I think. So then kind of the controlling factor in terms of economy of scale became what's the minimum order of boxes that's financially realistic? Because obviously if you order 100, they're really expensive. If you order 400, they're considerably cheaper. So I think we tend to think now in blocks of 400 because of the cost of having the boxes made. but there's no way we could have kept making the boxes. I mean, the laser cutting process it's hard work. It takes a lot of time.
How long are we talking here to make each copy, out of interest?
Well, with the base game, because it is all the ships are either grey or red acrylic, a roughly A3 sheet of either has enough things on it for 3 copies. So if you're making the deluxe version, which is where the ship names and ship details are etched onto the acrylics, that takes longer. It takes about 50 minutes to do 1 sheet, which is all the bits for 3 games. So it's about 100 minutes to do 3 deluxe games. The standard one with none of the etching takes about 22 minutes a sheet, so is considerably quicker.
Oh, wow, that's a huge difference.
Which is one of the reasons why deluxe is a lot more expensive.
yeah, I can see.
Yeah, it is. But I have to be with the laser cutter whilst it's running, but that doesn't mean I have to be stood over it staring at it like a hawk. So what I tend to do is I've set up my workshop so I can be doing stuff nearby in the same, well, my garage, whilst it's going along, because all the bits need cleaning. The backing of the acrylic needs peeling off each individual piece. All the wooden bits need assembling, and then the acrylic ship needs to go in the appropriate bag with the appropriate wooden pieces, and then it all gets collated into the box with all the bits as well. And I find with the acrylic, with the deluxe acrylic, there's time to do a chunk of that in that 50 minutes whilst a sheet is cutting. Whereas with the standard ones, because you've only got 22 minutes, there isn't enough time to do things, which is not something I'd have anticipated at all.
Yeah. Although it might be a lot faster, you can't run as much stuff in sort of parallel, as it were.
Yeah. So it feels weirdly less efficient, and as if it actually takes longer to produce a finished game. But I think one of our surprises was how well the deluxe version sold versus the standard.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we went into that first campaign thinking, I don't know, maybe a quarter of people will want the deluxe edition because it's a lot more expensive.
At the most, yeah.
And it ended up being somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 with deluxe, which just blew our minds. And that still happens now. I mean, we've done now 4 Flick Fleet campaigns and are about to do a 5th on Game Fact. And each one, the deluxe, has been way more popular than the standard. It does look cooler. You can see why.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Firstly, having seen it, it does look a lot cooler. Secondly, I think this from my experience so far, at least, seems to be a pretty classic feature of Kickstarter that most people will end up choosing the more deluxe option if it's available, as long as it's not absurdly more expensive. I mean, I think certainly for Magnate, we had 90% of the backers decided to go for the slightly more deluxe Tycoon version with all the frills and furbelows than they did just go with the core game. So interesting to hear that you had that, even with quite a big price differential. How much was the price difference again between the two?
So the deluxe game is £50 and the standard game is £30.
Yeah, so in percentage terms, at least £20, I guess, extra is not outrageous, but it is in percentage terms a very big difference between that if you can get the core one for 30.
And with our last Kickstarter, each Kickstarter we've run has been an expansion for Flick Fleet. So we've had a surprising number of people come back for the first expansion and then the second expansion and then the third expansion. But we've also had people coming on each time and going, this sounds cool, I'll get everything. And I'll get everything deluxe. And it's like, that's a lot of money. By the time you roll around to the 4th expansion, it was like over £200. But it's what people want. So.
Yeah, this is my experience as well, that if you offer at that point to buy everything at some kind of discount, so many people will go in and go, right, I'm all in. I'll take the deluxe version of something. We also continue to sell copies of the Magnate Tycoon edition on the website, and that has so completely outsold the core game as to the fact that we have only sold one copy of the core game on its own through the website. So it's selling it out at the rate of many tens, and how many is it in total? We've sold, since we launched the new store only at the beginning of the year, about 90. So it's just 90 just to 1 ratio of games, deluxe games to individual ones. So it's really interesting, isn't it? Like, I think it's something about seems to me something about, I guess, partly also the hobby niche. I also think, to be fair, your product as well seems like it's really good value, to be fair. Like, particularly if you know about, I've always felt like if you know about the production process, it's something I very much associate with it. And maybe that's because obviously I follow you both on Twitter. So I guess I'm exposed a little bit more to seeing the kind of behind the curtain story of how you produce it. But there's an element that I think almost it's sort of, there's a kind of reassuring artisan aspect to it that I feel like if you see it's £50, you're like, that's totally reasonable, because it's something you're very aware is being produced by hand.
Paul's been slaving in his garage for best part of an hour on that one copy.
Exactly. Which is really interesting. So I mean, that immediately raises to come back to that question about the handmade stuff. Obviously, so you both obviously really enjoy this physical craft element, and I guess that has to be really critical, because it's so interesting for me, because when you say, oh, I made these 300 copies by hand myself, and I'm thinking, oh my God, the thought of manufacturing it. Firstly, I would doubt my ability to make them look even remotely nice. I could do a reasonable prototype as far as making something for basic UX goes, but actually producing something to a high physical standard, I find it very difficult to imagine even enjoying that process. So can you tell me a bit more about what you feel like you also get out of it a bit? I mean, other than the margin and the sort of labor cost, which we kind of talked about, is kind of, I think for some extent, that all makes sense financially to me. I'm really interested to know more about this side of it, I guess.
Okay, right. We bought a laser cutter. I had never even seen a laser cutter until it turned up in my garage. And an engineer spent nearly a day installing it and very quickly teaching me how to use it. And it was like, oh my God, what have I committed to? Because we at this point, we have collected people's money from the Kickstarter campaign. I have to produce something.
Yeah.
So and it was really, really scary. And also, I'm in business with one of my best friends, and I didn't want to let him down either. So I thought, right, what am I going to do? So I went on YouTube and found out, how the hell do I use this thing? And then it luckily all kind of fell into place, and it was great. But what I discovered was, I do like making stuff. All my hobbies in the past have been quite artistic, but I've never been very good at them. I feel I'm artistic without having a huge amount of artistic skill and ability. So kind of using a laser cutter means you're straying into the realms of design as opposed to art. And you have to think in 2 dimensions all the time. And we have made game components that are 3-dimensional, but made out of 2-dimensional elements. And that was fun as well. But what I quickly found was it's very satisfying, because you put in a sheet of red or grey acrylic, and sometime later you have made little tiny spaceships. And I'll be honest, I still get a kick every time I do stand and watch it make things. There are some components in particular that just the process of the laser doing its job, I find slightly hypnotic and really, really satisfying.
Oh,
But
fantastic.
yeah. But the overwhelming thing is when I lift the lid, I switch it off, lift the lid, I use a cloth and wipe all the acrylic dust off the etch pieces. I lift the sprue, if you like, the framework with the bits we're not using, which just leaves the finished bits in situ on the laser cutter. I get a thrill out of that. Then I have to take them all off, clean them up, make sure there's no defects anywhere, and bin the ones that aren't right. There are often a few. And then I have to peel the backing paper off the acrylic. But at that point, it's like every single component, every single acrylic component, I have crafted and cared for. And the sense of overwhelming pride I have of knowing that, our game, which we've sold nearly 1,000 copies now all around the world, that these pieces I have made, I have cleaned, I have loved them, is now going out. And hopefully, the big thing for me, I love above all else, is when we get feedback from people saying, my kids love this game. And the sense that, it's bringing families together, it's bringing people together. And I know I have physically made every single one of those ships. If we had gone the other route and gone for injection molding, I would never have got to experience the sheer joy of knowing that I have personally contributed to people's enjoyment in life. That for me is worth the literally thousands of hours I have spent poured into this game. It was quite simple for me. It's just that I love that we've managed to do that. And that it was from, a slight, unhappiness with 2 games we both really, really wanted to like and just didn't quite. And then a 4-hour conversation, we designed a game that, people all around the world can play. What more is there?
Yeah. I mean, well, when you put it like that, it's utterly compelling. I think, thinking about the as you said, the joy that you get from the process, and then thinking about the end user and how they're going to be playing it, and they're going to be loving this thing that you've made.
There is a downside to that as well, of course, which is because it's been successful, it's not ending. And when we started with Flick Fleet, there were 2 colours of acrylic. I had 2 stacks of acrylic to work my way through. By the time we got to the 3rd expansion, there's 13 different colours or thicknesses. Yeah. So there's a lot more. So I have to store all of that, which is fun. Luckily, my wife is very, very supportive. Our garage is now Eurydice Games Flick Fleet Central, and I have stacks of acrylic everywhere. And then, of course, all the wooden components that come in massive boxes from a company in Germany. And then I have to spend hundreds of hours sorting all those bits out and quality controlling those as well. But weirdly, I actually find most of that relaxing. But the multiple colours of acrylic can get a little stressful, especially when it's delivered by a lorry with a pallet that just dumps it on your drive, and it's like, okay, yeah, got to do something with all these.
And it was a crazy weight as well, wasn't it? That pallet, it was like a third of a ton or something. It was some utterly daft number.
Yeah, he had a pallet mover, and when he put it down and removed the I don't know what it's called, the thing with the prongs that carries it.
Pallet truck?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, the wooden pallet itself actually just collapsed. So we actually had to. My wife and I spent the evening physically carrying stacks of acrylic into the garage. And we used to have an air hockey table that is now a workbench, and a lot of the acrylic stacks neatly underneath and around that in a safe way. So yeah, but.
How does she feel about that? About being roped in to carry acrylic, and I imagine the gradually sort of growing size of this workshop and storage area.
Yeah. I have to say, I chose well. My wife is incredibly supportive and understanding and indulgent, and I think she gets what we get from doing this. She likes reading the reviews and people's comments, and it always makes her smile. Again, when she sees that families are engaging with something we've put so much love and care into. And I think she likes seeing how happy doing this makes me, and that's wonderful. But yeah, I think when we had the last load of boxes delivered, and we had the base game boxes, expansion 1 boxes, and then expansion 2 and 3 share a box. Effectively, it can be multi-purpose. But literally, a lorry turned up from Poland with several thousand boxes.
1,600.
Was it 1,600? It felt like more, which we then had to somehow store in our house. So a landing up in our loft area became like devoid of everything except boxes.
And these are the game boxes that would be the ones that you had printed that everything would pack into. Because by this point, manufacturing the boxes yourself sounds like it's just a no-go, basically.
Yeah. And I mean,
absolutely.
Actually, just going back to what we were talking about before, I remember having a moment of anxiety when we started, because our boxes are small. We both, as most gamers have loads of boxes where it feels like you've paid for 80% oxygen in the box.
Yeah.
Splendor.
And yeah. And that, we're both aware of, we have finite storage space for our game collections, and that wasn't something we wanted to add to. So we went for kind of all of our games fit in a box of the same size, but it is quite small. And I was a little bit worried that, given how much people were paying, particularly for the deluxe version, they might, be expecting this huge thing, and then they get this tiny little thing. But actually, the feedback we get is people really like that, because they feel that they've got this little box, but it's stuffed with things. Especially the last 2 expansions, which the lid barely closes on, because there's so much in there. We probably should have thought about that before we committed to how much stuff we were putting in those boxes. But
that was the campaigns with 500 and 1,000 pound targets, which unlocked an awful lot of stretch goals, which ended up with a lot more stuff in them than we expected. But yeah, the small boxes, I mean, they're terrible for retail, but we don't really sell in retail. We have no distributors. There's only 5 shops in the world as of last weekend that carry it. So it's not something we need to worry about, the sort of the shelf presence that you need to consider when you're making a game that's going into retail shops. We can make a box that fits the stuff and not a lot else.
That definitely seems like something you don't really need to worry about as much if you're only selling direct. Then again, this whole issue of needing something that looks impressive on a shelf just sort of fades into the background a little bit, doesn't it? I mean, it's nice to have a really lovely object.
Exactly, yeah.
Again, I guess more of the pleasure of the object is in what's inside the box, less the box itself. Although I have to say that I'm looking at casting my eyes over to my FlickFleet box right now. It is still a very nice box, however.
Thank you.
Like, I think it looks really good. I'm interested to hear, in fact, that you've got any retailers at all, because I would have thought that possibly the kind of margins at which, I guess it's difficult to say because you're using so much of the labor yourselves, but makes it quite challenging to sell that to a retailer.
It's incredibly difficult to sell it to a retail. So the traditional model would be that your manufacturing cost is 20% of the price of the game. You sell it to distributors at 40% of price plus VAT. They sell it on to retailers at 50% plus VAT. And then retailers have got that 50% minus VAT to pay their VAT, their staff, their business rates and all that kind of stuff. We're so small, we're not VAT registered. So our prices are essentially ex-VAT prices, but they're higher because they're not ex-VAT. So essentially we're in we're in a small chain of shops in the northeast of England called Travelling Man, and we're in their small press comics section. So they sell comics that are designed by people who literally print them at home. So we're bundled in with that. So we're sort of treated in the same bucket as those. And we were running some ads in the UK a month or so ago, and one of the directors of a shop in Leicester saw one of those ads and asked us to come down and do a demo day. So Paul went down on Saturday. He demoed FlickFleet to a bunch of their customers, sold several copies. They took several more for stock. And he's been in touch since then saying, can we get the expansion as well, please? So I think we're going to hook up with him at the UK Games Expo and over some more stuff. But yeah, because we're not VAT registered, because we're not, the boxes are small, our margins are nowhere near good enough to go to distribution and not really good enough to go into retail. There's very, very few people who are interested in that. And it's not something that is actually that good for us, other than obviously it gets it in front of more people and more people get the joy of FlickFleet, which is always great.
Yeah, it's interesting that you're in the small press section, as you said, of Travelling Man, because the moment you said Travelling Man, I think about their board games. They've got quite a big selection, right?
Yeah,
of generally,
absolutely. And they've got four stores as well. We're in all of those.
I think I first came across them because they're a sponsor of Aircon, I think, from memory.
Yeah.
And and so it's interesting that they obviously fit with that because it's the same kind of more craft orientated small run thing, rather than being sort of, as you said, well, I mean, a Splendor would be a good example of a game that's manufactured at massive scale, probably for pretty tiny production cost, I would guess, for each one of those units. So yeah, that presents interesting challenges. So what then is kind of maybe this isn't important, but what is the growth potential for FlickFleet? Is it something where presumably if you say, let's say the demand for it tripled, that would actually be in some ways more of a problem than something that would be a benefit? How do you see that, out of interest?
When we fulfilled the last Kickstarter, which had there's some entertaining stories about fulfilling the last Kickstarter. But when we fulfilled the last Kickstarter, it was the deluxe rewards were due to go out by the end of September, I think. And we received the last box of wooden bits, which had something we needed to put in all of the boxes, on the 30th of September, I think it was. There'd been, so it had been shipped in 3 boxes. 2 of the boxes had arrived. I think one of the boxes arrived at Paul's house. One of them went to a depot and we weren't told that it was waiting for VAT payment. So we didn't know it was at the depot, and it had been there for like 2 weeks. So when we found out, when we finally got tracking information and tracked it down, it was like, oh my God, they were about to send it back to Germany. So Paul ran over and got that. The 3rd one got sent to me, not Paul. Again, we didn't get tracking information. Again, we didn't get a notification that that payment was due. So by the time I finally tracked it down, they said, yeah, we just sent that back to Germany yesterday. So it went back to Germany. It sat in a German depot at DPD or whatever for 2 weeks. Then it got back to the manufacturer, who sent it back to us. And that arrived like literally the day that the rewards were due to be sent. So they were late. So Paul worked frantically for that first month. So October, so they were due to go out to get to the customers by the end of September. We got the last piece we needed on the last day of September, and then Paul worked absolutely flat out in October. I mean, that month, if you're looking at from a financial point of view, when you get Kickstarter money, that money isn't actually sales, that's orders, or it's essentially you owe money to somebody. It doesn't become a sale until you actually ship it, or ideally until the customer receives it, although we can't really keep track of that. So that month was our best month ever, because we sold like 250 or nearly 300 deluxe rewards that ranged between a copy of the fourth expansion and a deluxe copy of the fourth expansion, or all the way up to a deluxe copy of the base game, the first expansion, the second expansion, and the third expansion. So that month was our biggest month in terms of sales by like at least double, I think. So in theory, if every month was like that, we could do 7 or 8 times what we're planning to do this year in terms of sales. But Paul would be working flat out every week of the year.
So that's probably not quite the sustainable reality of it. I don't know. You're shaking your head, Paul. Maybe you can.
Yeah, for 6 months or so, it would be fine. I think longer than that, we might need to have a think. But I'm aware, it takes a toll physically and mentally. Because I view it as a labour of love, I do have to be careful that I don't forget that there are other elements to my life as well. It's easy to let everything else slip because you've got a deadline. And one of the things I've really enjoyed about working with Jack is how honest we are with each other. And if I say, look, I just can't do this in time, out goes an update saying, folks, really sorry, it's going to be a month late. And I think our backers have been really understanding, because they know it's the two of us basically in my garage making this, and like with the wooden bits, that just it wasn't our fault. There was nothing we could do about that. It was just a complete unforeseen screw up, basically.
Brexit dividend, I think is what
it's called. Yeah. So these things are going to happen. You've got to roll with the punches.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I'm quite conscious of, having run a company previously where I went from making games by hand to in the low hundreds to making games in a factory in the low thousands, was the fact that I wasn't as a company ready to make that jump. I didn't have enough customers. I didn't have any marketing or whatever skills. And so although I did sell probably half of those genuinely like proper sales to distributors and shops and at conventions and things, I was left with a lot of games in a warehouse that I was paying more in terms of warehousing fees than I was earning in terms of sales some months. So I'm very conscious that you've got to be at the right point before you make the jump. But at some point, if we did get 3 times bigger, we could probably carry on doing what we're doing now. It would mean Paul would be working harder for more months of the year. But if we got like 10 times bigger, then I think we would be making games 10 times. We say we're selling 300 or 400 copies a year through a Kickstarter at the moment, then that's like 3,000 or 4,000 copies a year. And at that point, genuinely, you're at the point where you can get those injection molds made and start making professional runs in a factory somewhere. At which point, hopefully, your margins are in a position where distribution and retail is a sensible option, and you're not trying to carry the can entirely yourself.
Yeah, and I guess you'd need those anyway, because probably just to get access to that volume of customers. I mean, I think this is something definitely I'm experiencing. We've been very fortunate that so far we've been able to sell almost entirely to retailers and to individuals. And that's even on a print run of 3,000 units was our first one. And that has basically completely sold out. So
excellent. Congratulations.
Thank you very much. I've been very, very pleased with that. So we're ordering another run, and we've got the German and Korean versions, which will be coming out as well later in the year.
Very exciting.
So that's been really, really interesting. It was super surreal seeing Korean scripts all over the box, and all the components just being like, wow, this is awesome. Like, this is so wild.
Always good to see a bit of Hangul. I did a taekwondo for a number of years. So I started learning to read Hangul. It's a brilliant idea. So they wanted to diverge themselves from the Chinese letters that were being used at the time. Right. So the king of Korea at the time said to a scientist, design a script of our own. And it's really, once you recognize the components of the letter, well, I don't think they're called letters, but the individual symbols.
Glyphs, I guess, symbols, yeah.
Maybe glyphs, yeah. Each one is made up of like 3 or 4 pieces.
Yeah.
And each one you can read essentially, and it makes a sensible sound. So it's like German in the sense that if you know how to pronounce things, you can just read it. You might not understand what it says, but you can pronounce it pretty accurately just by reading. Unlike English, where of course there's like 3 different words that are spelled completely differently and pronounced exactly the same.
Yeah, and of course, as in terms of the break with Chinese as well, like with Chinese, you just have to know. Like you look at the character, there's no inherent information about how it's pronounced at all. So that's really interesting. Yes, well, I mean, oh wow. So I expect if I showed you the currently top secret cover art and pieces that I've been getting, you'd be able to go, oh, I can read that.
Sadly not. A while back, maybe 15 years ago, I might have stood a chance, but.
It's really fascinating, isn't it? It's kind of cultural differences, and I think it's been interesting for us thinking about how we access those sales channels, because now we're doing a reprint. I'm very aware that we have to start, making more of those distributor relationships, I think, to really start moving those kind of serious volumes. So in fact, if we go back a bit, because I had a quick look at your previous company's games on BGG, and I want to make sure I pronounce the name of the company correctly. Is it Revia? Is that how you say it? Riva. Oh, it said Riva.
My special skill is coming up with company names that are unpronounceable and difficult to spell.
Eurydice, that's correct, isn't it? I've got that right. Yes, good. I remember my Greek myths, so I was able to do that. I think
excellent.
I think a listener asked a sort of slightly cheeky question, I think, on Twitter earlier about this, saying, "Do you ever look back?" I think was the thing, obviously referring to the myth of Orpheus. And I thought, initially I was like, "What's he talking about?" And then, big groan there. Yeah, that's a bit of a challenge, isn't it? If you come up with names that are that you can only pronounce if you're incredibly, if you had a sort of classical education. It's an interesting one, isn't it?
So the name was actually chosen by a guy who follows me on Twitter from South Africa. And I said, I'm looking for a new company name. I'd like it a bit of a reference back to Riva Games and the fact that I don't want to make the same mistakes. And so he came up with Eurydice.
Oh, brilliant.
Don't look back. So there is some meaning to that, which is pretty cool.
Difficult to pronounce on the first hand, maybe a little bit for some at least, but actually quite a meaningful name, actually, in terms of really capturing something quite important about your own journey.
I really liked that the 2 halves of it are Yuri, which is a bit like Euro, and Dice, which also works quite well.
Something I was thinking about precisely earlier today, I was looking at thinking, pick that partly because it's a bit like Eurydice, almost like it's something like that.
And most people mispronounce it. Most people call it
Eurydice, because well, why not? That sounds like a...
Exactly. So we kind of lent into that a bit with the new logo.
Sort of sounds a bit like a Russian board game, doesn't it? Eurydice, something like that, maybe. So that's really interesting. So I noticed that actually some of the games that you had on there have achieved pretty high rankings on BGG, really, like looking at them.
They were reasonable sized print runs. So Border Reavers, I made 100 copies of by hand. It's Alive, I made 300 copies of by hand. And then the reprint was 3,000 copies. Carpe Astra was, I think, 2,000 copies. And then Sumeria was 3,000 copies as well. So BGG rankings, because of the Bayesian weighting thing they do, they really punish games with a very small number of rankings. So in what's it called, like indie games like us, where we've only sold less than 1,000 copies, and lots of those aren't to BGG members, our rankings are pretty low, even though our average rating is really high. I mean, I think it's still 8.1 for Flick Fleet at the moment.
8.1, it is, yeah.
Oh wow, that's a really high average.
And I happen to know it's 8.1 from 139 ratings.
Yeah, and that's been pretty static. I think at the very beginning it was like 8.3 or something, and then it dipped to 8.2, but it's been 8.1 for a couple of years now, and the number of ratings is sort of steadily increasing, and the average is holding pretty stable, which, I mean, we're obviously delighted about. but it's still such a small number of ratings that the 100 5.5s or whatever it is they throw into it outweigh it. And so our ranking is like in the top, just outside the top 6,000, whereas something like It's Alive or Carpe Astra, which sold 2,000 units in the end, even though it's got a much lower average, it's probably got a much higher ranking on BGG just because of the higher number of ratings.
Yeah, I think looking at It's Alive right now, I just have it up in front of me. I think it says ranked 4,095. So yeah, much higher, I guess, just because of the way the algorithm works, really more than anything. Yeah, interesting, very interesting in terms of you have these two completely different ways of producing that you've kind of experienced both sides of. But also, I'm so glad to hear that actually you think you could scale up on the Flick Fleet side quite substantially. So if that happened, then Paul, is that going to be like your full-time job, just producing games? Do you think at that point?
Well, I mean, at the moment it is. I draw a salary. I draw a small salary. I used to work in education, and then I got a job working at a university, which my contract just came to an end. So I was kind of at a bit of a loose end, trying to work out what I should do next. Should I go back to teaching? Could I explore something else? And then it was like, well, actually, I could get paid to do this for a year and see how it goes, which was fortunate because then obviously the Kickstarter happened and blew up on us. So it's been, I mean, I'd have done it without getting paid, but it's quite nice to get paid for doing it. And I'm hoping
not have to do it around another job.
Yeah. I mean, that there were times when it had got a bit difficult. I'll be honest, and more mentally than physically, if that makes sense. The kind of the mental processes of running two jobs that are so different was sometimes quite hard. And having to switch gears and go from kind of like high level strategy meetings to playing with my laser cutter was often quite difficult to balance. So having had this kind of coming up to a year to kind of just focus on the one thing and give it my all, and I mean it hasn't been smooth sailing by any means, but it's been for me quite a personally enriching period to put all my eggs in one basket and focus on doing one thing. And I like the range of tasks that it encapsulates. So it would scale, and I would be happy to do that. But I'm aware, just physically, without having a second laser cutter, there is a limit to just physically how much we can produce in the time we have. And I don't think we'd feel comfortable saying to deluxe backers, "You'll get it in a year." That's something we've tried to avoid, that kind of very common pitfall of Kickstarter, I think.
Well, yeah, I mean, you've been able to deliver really quickly, I guess, again, because you control the whole process. I think in the end, we were only about a year delayed, which seems to be about average, which I'm going to count as a win during a pandemic. And, but even then, just I don't have to manage any of that, but all of that, there's so much going on. But I guess you control the production process. I guess most of your customers are in the UK, but presumably you've got customers around the world as well. Oh, not in the UK.
Half of our customers are from America.
Oh, interesting. So actually, that's your single biggest market.
I would say our single biggest market is Texas, actually.
So yeah, it's a half in the US, a quarter in the UK. It was about 15% in Europe, but obviously Brexit has complicated that, so that's dropped off recently. And then all over, we've had sales to Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Malaysia, Taiwan, China, Japan, Russia. Obviously, that's dropped off.
That's really fascinating, isn't it? Like the extent to which sort of every size publisher is kind of born international now. So your biggest market is not your home market already. That's very much the same for me as well. Our biggest market is absolutely the US by a country mile. And you're instantly selling to everywhere. I mean, places like you said, Japan, Malaysia, all around the world, very extensively. I mean, that kind of means, though, you've got to deal with some of the complications of selling internationally, right? Like almost from day one. How do you, I mean, I assume you just can't offer things like friendly shipping to all of those places.
No, Paul literally takes things to the post office. The ones that I ship have handwritten labels. We're not drop shipping things to places for friendly shipping. I mean, the other thing, of course, is especially for the last two campaigns, there's been a lot of customization of rewards. So people will get the they'll get the expansion, but then some of them will want an extra one of these and 2 extra ones of those. And can I get that thing as well? And I'd like some extra dice. And so the having somebody else do that for us in warehousing somewhere in Europe or somewhere in the US would be very expensive, I think, on top of the fact that we'd have to make up the games and ship them. And none of the games are shrink wrapped because we don't have a shrink wrapping machine. For the deluxe rewards, we offer personalization, so you can have your name or your family name or a random quote handwritten on the inside of the box lid. Again, that would make they would be incredibly difficult to do for drop shipping for friendly shipping purposes.
Just to put that in perspective, what Jack means is when all the bits are in a standard box, that's a standard copy of the game, good to go. However, if it's a deluxe version, we have a deluxe sticker that has to be carefully situated on the front lid of the box. Then I have to take the lid off. Each copy is numbered in the top right corner. We then have stickers that we've both signed, that there is a message unique to the game, the expansion 1, the expansion 2, etc., that gets stuck in the lid. And then if someone has requested a message, that gets handwritten by me in the lid as well. And I've had by Grabthar's hammer many, many times. May the force be with you, quite a few times. Many, many to random people or family names or nicknames or whatever. And I love doing it, but oh my God, it takes so long.
And you've got to be really careful then that you get the right signed box in the right shipping crate.
Yeah, that's the other thing. You can't just grab one off the shelf and stick it in the shipping container. You've got to check you've done everything correctly. And that's on top of checking you've added in the extra set of asteroids or the extra dice or the option 13 or whatever someone has ordered on top of the base game or whatever.
That's really interesting. I mean, I think something people don't even realize is how difficult it is just to make sure that orders are instructed properly, even when you're using a drop shipping service. Something. I mean, I found you've got all these different warehouses that we work with. They've all got different formats in different places. Just making sure that we get the customer information out of one system, and it really is absolutely certain that all the right things are going to the right address. And then that's without any kind of customization, and there being people whose job it is every day in those warehouses just to do that. Yeah, the logistical complexity of this, I think, is sorely. I underrated it as a publisher, and for you, I can imagine there's even you're doing that, but the whole end-to-end process.
Yeah, and I mean, I tend to black out shipping days as not manufacturing days because it's that labor-intensive a process. I mean, just getting all the boxes and all the bits and all the stuff we've just talked about, and then wrapping it in bubble wrap, making up a container, putting it in the container, taping the container, addressing the container, or if we're doing it like through FedEx or something, printing off the label with all the custom stuff. It's a long process, and I think I know we're never going to be at the scale where we can use someone to do that for us, but it is the element that gives me the single most scared sensation, because it's the bit where it's very easy to make a mistake. And I have made a couple. I have made a few, not many, I don't think, but I can't blame anyone. We've not hired someone to do it for us. We've not paid for a service. It's me. So when something goes wrong, that's on me. And like I said, there have been a few instances.
I fill in the spreadsheet that you do that from. So
yeah, and to be fair, that has happened too, once, I think. But I mean, luckily, one of the mistakes I made was I'd accidentally, at some point in the process, put a standard ship in instead of a deluxe one. But luckily, amazingly, the person who this was a mistake for lived in York, where I'm based. So I actually drove round to his house and gave him the right ship.
Oh, wow.
And he gave us a glowing review because he thought that was just like, and we're talking, it's a little tiny ship. It's like a little piece of red acrylic about 3 centimeters long.
That's customer service, isn't it? It's like the publishers drive around your house with the spare component.
Yeah, sadly that was a one-off. But I've made the odd packing mistake, and I think more commonly we've missed something somewhere. I think that's happened 2 or 3 times. But out of getting on for probably 1,500, 2,000 orders in total.
Yeah, it must be approaching that now.
Yeah, I think we've only had a handful of mistakes. So I feel like I said, it makes me nervous because I want the process to be good for everyone involved. But that is the element that scares me the most. And dealing with all the paperwork side of shipping with customs invoices and whatnot is just it's so complicated. I don't think people realise just what
And
that's about.
Brexit's been a massive pain for that, huge pain.
Yeah, that's awful. Like the amount of paperwork on everything, as you said, custom side of it. It's been really interesting. I feel like I've spent the last couple of years learning so much about tax law and customs that it is something actually now I'm exploring if I can start doing for other companies, just because I've realized, well, now I know all of this. Is there somewhere to leverage this? Because I think a big challenge of it is that, yeah, it's hugely complicated. There's so much, and different territories have got different rules to manage all of these things. So yeah, painful.
And the thing I find frustrating is you can send something to a country that was identical to something you sent there last week, but something goes wrong, and there's never any explanation of what it was that went wrong. So then it comes back to you, and you do the same thing again, and it's like, well, did I do it right the first time and not the second time? And I thought it was identical, and then it works. But I have found it's very frustrating. But I have found shipping to the US, as much as possible, I like using FedEx, because all their custom stuff is done electronically. So you haven't got to print off customs invoices, which then you have to tape to the outside of the package and everything. And I know FedEx has its own issues, and I know a lot of Americans are not keen on them, but from my point of view, it works really easily because I haven't got that extra layer of printing out things in triplicate and dating and signing them and sticking them onto the box in the hope that they don't get ripped off in transit. That's all abstracted away.
They seem to be good at the international parcels. I know that most of the fulfillment centers we use internally in the US much prefer either UPS or USPS, but for sort of international packages, I mean, we generally get our sort of samples sent from China, for example, from them, and we found them actually, yeah, really good for that. The customs thing is fascinating. We had, I think, the most hilarious example for me recently was actually about a year ago. I was sending a prototype copy of Magnate to Belgium, and I had to send it in 2 boxes because the prototype came in 2 exactly identical size boxes. And it was just much cheaper to send them in 2 parcels rather than in 1 parcel by Royal Mail. So I thought, okay, I'll do that. I carefully divided the weight of the contents between the 2, mixing up the contents between the 2 of them so that you would reassemble the game at the other side with the 2 boxes. They were exactly the same dimensions, going from exactly the same post office with exactly the same customs information, but sent at the same moment in time. And one of them got stopped and the other one got through, thus making it useless that only one of the packages reached there, because they couldn't even play it, because like, I've just got the buildings and the money. And I'm like, great, none of the other components have arrived. And it just blew my mind. I was like, these couldn't have been more identical. And yet, no, arbitrarily, no, we're going to send that one back, and you will send that one on.
Yeah, it's ridiculous, isn't it? And I think though there is an interesting vulnerability as a small publisher, which people may not be aware of. But every time a parcel fails to arrive, well, we've got to send that again. So, and if it's an international one, that's another chunk of shipping money, as well as another copy of whatever's gone missing. And we've had that happen 5-6 times now, I think.
Probably more than that. It's probably nearer to 10.
And that eats into our very small profit margin quite quickly. And trying to get money back from shipping companies, that's interesting.
Oh, yeah. The answer seems to be like most of them don't even bother most of the time trying to do that. Okay, so if you've got someone's listening to this and they're thinking, I really, for all of that with the shipping of the fulfillment pains and those things, but actually I like the sound of manufacturing my own stuff rather than doing it the more classic way of I'll find a factory in Poland, I'll find a factory in China, they'll produce everything for me and I'll have as little to do with the physical side as possible. What kind of tips would you give them as now being really quite experienced at this and actually scaling up to the point in terms of revenue terms of actually quite a lot bigger than a lot of the small Kickstarter companies that are making games in a factory in Poland or somewhere in China? You're actually shifting more units with more revenue than they are. And they thought to themselves, I'd love to go down this self-manufacturing approach. What would be your kind of top tips for them?
Probably the first one is make sure you really understand what you're getting yourself into. If you think I can make 100 copies of that or whatever, make 5 copies of that to a standard that you're happy with, work out how long that took you, extrapolate how long it's going to take you to make the next 100, how much you need, assume you sell all 100 in a year, how many hours a week is that you've got to fit around your day job and your family and friends and what have you. It's, in a lot of ways, it's really liberating, because we can do a print run of 100, 200, 400, which you just can't do if you go to a factory in China or a factory in Poland. They're at least, I mean, usually the minimum order quantity is 1,000. Sometimes you can get 500, but usually it's 1,000 or more. So it gives you the possibility of you're not storing 1,000 copies in a warehouse or in your flat, because you're physically making them. You can usually flat pack most of the components, so it takes up less space than if you had 1,000 finished copies of the game. So, I mean, when I was making Bordereivas, I was in a tiny 1-bed flat in York, my wife and I, and we had 100 copies of Bordereivas in the house to begin with, and it was a stack of grey board that was going to become boxes and tiles. It was a box of printed A3 paper, a card that was going to be cut up into a deck of cards, well, 100 decks of cards. Another box with all the wooden pieces in, a box with all the plastic pieces in. So it didn't take up much space at all, really. 100 copies of the finished game would have taken up 50% more space, well, probably more than 50%, probably quite a lot more space, because everything was flat packed. So there are a lot of advantages to doing it that way. You have to set aside a crap load of time. You've got to make sure that the people you live with and the people you see are prepared for you to do that. You've got to think about, do you really have that time available around your day job or your university course or whatever it is you do during the day? But I think you get a lot of freedom. You get a lot of control over things. We're both control enthusiasts. That's what we're calling ourselves now. I like that. Thank you, Paul. Absolutely going to take that. He did mean control freak, in my case at least. So there's a lot of benefits from it from that point of view. And it's liberating, because you can do crazy things that you wouldn't be able to do if you went to a factory in China and said, we've got the classic example of Box of Flicks 2. That's got a ridiculous number of components in a Flick Fleet sized box. It's got transparent acrylic nebula. It's got comets. It's got wooden meeples. It's got 10 different types of ships or something like that. It's got dashboards. It's got all sorts. They're laser etched on the top in the deluxe cases. So you would need to make an individual mold for each ship, because they've all got their names etched on top of them. And to make that injection molded with that level of detail, the minimum order would have to be like 20,000 or something, because you'd have so many different molds to do it. We made a print run of 350 copies of that and sold 250 of them through the Kickstarter. In fact, 280 of them through the Kickstarter.
There's also a question here where it might be, provided they can meet that first test, which seems really critical. That you can make 5, you enjoy the process of it. Something that Paul, that came across so loud and clear was for you that there's an almost Zen-like joy almost in creating, manufacturing the pieces, again and again. You've got to make sure you've got that, I guess, that you enjoy the process and that you can make the time and the physical space. But it's really interesting what you say about the actual physical ships, that there are things you can do at that scale that actually you can only do again once you have an enormous scale.
Yeah, looking back, I think had we gone down the injection molding route initially, we would have struggled to add some of the elements we've added, because we would have been stuck with a mold that just does what it does, and we would have, the cost of creating something new in a mold would be seriously off-putting, especially, I'll be honest, by the time we got to Box of Flicks 2, I wasn't tiring of Flick Fleet, but I kind of felt like I wanted something different to do. And the ideas were drying up a little bit, and we'd had the idea of moving towards Xeno Wars, which is what we're doing next, but it still felt quite a long way off. But through discussion with fans of Flick Fleet and finding out, hang on, we've got this group of, designers essentially who've got all these fabulous ideas. So we actually ran a little competition to, get those ideas and sift through them and see what could we work up into a playable prototype and then see if it works. And they had ideas that were amazing. And, however enthusiastic and passionate about the game we are, we would never in a million years have come up with them. Things like the hyperspace Kraken, that just is not something we would ever have thought of ourselves, but it's a brilliant addition to the game.
And Box of Flicks 2 is like probably 50%, if not slightly more than that, fan design content. And obviously we paid those people what's the word?
Royalty.
Thank you, Paul. Yeah, so we gave them a royalty
cool.
for the ideas they came up with.
And the design credit in the rules and on the box as well. And to be fair, some of the other ideas that we had were sparked off from their ideas as well. It kind of reinvigorated us a bit. And I would say when I'm making those pieces, that those stories attached to the things I'm making makes me so happy that it's like, it's not just our creation now. It's generally part of this community of people who enjoy the game, and it's making their bit of it come to life as well. That's really cool. But just going back to your question, I think when I joined Eurydice Games, and I think it was a practical arrangement originally, but we had lots of discussions about the two of us forming a company and what that meant. And we always said that the important things for us were that we didn't want it to cost us our own money. We felt that was not, obviously we've invested in our company, but we didn't want it to be a money sink for us. We wanted it not to put pressure on our friendship, and we only wanted to do it if we were enjoying it. And we do every few months have a reality check that we're still both, we can tick the boxes for all three of those. But I do think if we were starting off now, I think, I don't know quite how to put this, but I may have said no initially if I'd realised I was going to have to learn how to use a laser cutter. Because of where I was at that stage in my life, that would have felt like just too big a thing to take on all that responsibility. Because I didn't totally understand how big a responsibility it was going to be, and I did it, I'm now so relieved I did, because I know how to use a laser cutter. I now understand the CAD process to create something. That for me personally, I'm nearing 50. Learning that new skill set was just so invigorating. It was brilliant. But I would echo that for me, a lot of the issues really are physical and practical. It is about the storage space. It is about having the workspace. And like, Jack described having, a stack of grey board and a stack of stickers. That is true. You do have to store those, but then you also have to have the space accessible to turn them into something. I'm quite lucky that we have the garage and the air hockey table and the workbench to store the laser cutter on. Obviously, not everyone's going to be that lucky. It may be in the future. The biggest issue of us scaling up is actually we may need to hire a storage unit, because there are limits to just physically how much stuff I can fit in my house. So you've got to be realistic about those constraints. But I think my key thing is be very aware of what the different steps in it all are, and be very clear which ones you have zero interest or skill in doing, and ask yourself, is that something I will upskill myself in, or do I need to get help with that? Jack and I are quite lucky because we are great friends. Our tastes in board games are bizarrely similar, but we're very different people. Jack looks at spreadsheets and gets excited. I look at spreadsheets and I just kind of close off emotionally. But give me something to do with a computer-aided design package, and I love that, and I can get my teeth stuck into it. And I remember having many, many frustrated conversations with you, Jack, trying to explain why you can't etch a line on a laser cutter. And that was it was really good fun. But yeah, you've got to know what you are prepared to do and what you're getting yourself into, because I think it's been interesting. I often don't think of myself as a game designer. I do think of myself as a publisher, and at the moment very much a manufacturer, because that's what all my time is spent doing. And then other times you have to become a bit of a distribution and shipping expert as well. So your role changes, and because it's just the two of us, it all falls on us, and that can feel like a huge responsibility. Luckily, we're doing it with our best mates, so it kind of balances out.
Because we're so small, we don't have the money to do a lot of things. I hand rolled the website. We don't We don't have a nice WordPress site that some design studio had done for us. I do the bookkeeping myself. I do all the sales and marketing. I do a lot of the graphic design myself. So if you think design and publisher, you think, oh, I've got to design games, I've got to play test games, that's going to be great. Maybe I'll go to some conventions, get my expenses paid. But you also need to do bookkeeping, you need to do sales and marketing, you need to do shipping, you need to do making the thing, you need to do all these extra things which you don't necessarily think of, which take up a surprising amount of time.
I think I would be lucky, to be honest, if 10% of my week was game design. I feel like almost everything is taken up in those other things. I couldn't agree more. Like as you said, just bookkeeping, I similarly do that myself. Just managing your relationships with retailers or with distributors, as you said, shipping and fulfillment, all of those things. I seem to spend a lot of my time on things like operations or getting new business. Marketing is really fundamental. That's such a key part.
Yeah, I'm hopeless at marketing.
Yeah, we have no clue what we're doing on that front.
Well, I don't know. I would say your escalatingly good revenue numbers would say otherwise. It seems like you've found at least a niche of people who, okay, well, yeah, it's not a CMON campaign, but what is other than a CMON campaign or Kingdom Death Monster, right? Like that's you 7% growth per year. That's great. 5 years, you're still growing. That's really good. You've obviously cottoned onto something here. You've found something that fits, right?
Luck.
You think luck?
Luck. I think we were very lucky in that the idea we had in Flickfleet was a really good idea. I mean, that sounds horribly self-aggrandizing.
I think if you call it luck, I don't think it sounds at all self-aggrandizing.
Yeah. It just works.
It came together immensely smoothly and quickly. I mean, I've published or self-published 6 games now. Some of them I've had to drag kicking and screaming to the finish line. Flickfleet wasn't like that at all. Some of them have done pretty well. Some of them have done pretty poorly. Flickfleet, although it hasn't sold the most copies, because we're selling direct to customers through Kickstarter or the website, and because we've done now 3 expansions, I've made and sold 3,300 copies of It's Alive, and Flickfleet has the sales of Flickfleet and its expansions are more than 3 times what I made selling It's Alive. We've sold 900 and something copies of Flickfleet, 500 and something copies of the first expansion, and 200 or 300 copies of the second and third expansions. So the numbers are tiny, but because it's direct to consumer, the sale is actually quite a lot of money. And especially in the case of the Box of Flicks one, it was a load of stuff. So it was actually ended up being quite pricey. So yeah, I mean, the fact that Flickfleet, I mean, we've had people describe it as a lifestyle game. It's something that there are people who have been playing it regularly for years who are still excited about it. Which is amazing. I mean, you know what it's like in the current market. Each game's got a lifespan of 3 months or something, and then it's last week's news and it's all moved on to something else. So from that point of view, I think we have been very lucky that Flickfleet has performed so well. I mean, obviously, it has to be a pretty good game, and we did design it, so it's not purely luck, but I think it was lucky that Flickfleet has that the first game we decided to publish turned out to do so well.
Yes, well, certainly, I guess the first game you'll publish together as a duo, anyway, certainly that there's. But again, I would say to me the common pattern that I can see there is this commitment to product quality. It seems like you're really big on customer service. You're really good on treating customers really well, making sure the products are really, really good. And it seems like it's not really coincidental that you're being somewhat rewarded for that commitment to those 2 things by, getting good sales. And obviously the product has to be really good, which meant that you had to kind of just get a really good idea and then bring it to life. But it strikes me that all of those things to me seem quite correlated with what you would expect in terms of success. I think people don't always commit to those things, and obviously a huge amount of work to do that. I mean, just thinking, Paul, Yes, well, thinking about Paul, your production process and the commitment to that is a big part of what drives that, right? Because if you were knocking them out really fast and they're all a bit ropey, I suspect people wouldn't have anything like the same love for the game as they do.
No, I think you're right, and that is important to us. I mean, if we didn't have that care and attention, I don't think we'd enjoy it in the same way. I mean, it raises interesting questions about the future, and you know, I'm not saying it's coming to an end, but I feel we're more than halfway through what we can do with Flick Fleet. So then it's what do we do next, and we've got to come up. Obviously, we have several irons in the fire, but it's making sure we both have that level of enthusiasm for what we do next, because the way we make it, you need to have that enthusiasm or it's just a grind. And that isn't, and then when we get back to those three fundamental questions, is it costing us our own money? Is it affecting our friendship? Are we having fun? If we're not having fun, then we need to have an interesting conversation, I think. But in the nearer future, I think yeah, luck has definitely played a part, and it is a very good, solid game. It does exactly what that walk around Cragside discussion, but it's the game we talked about.
Yeah.
It really is. It's just how I wanted it to be. But I think as well as luck, there was something to do with the nature of Kickstarter. I think we hit a chord with people, and a lot of our backers came from within the Kickstarter architecture. We tried doing things like Board Game Geek ads and trying to build a community through there, and it just didn't really pay off. Whereas through Kickstarter itself, that's where most of our backers came from. And we find ourselves now in the difficult position that we are shifting to GameFound for Flick Fleet Xeno Wars, hopefully quite soon. And that's it's not causing sleepless nights, but it's certainly been on my mind, and I'm sure it's been on Jack's a lot, that we're doing this for ethical reasons. We're comfortable with that decision, but it means there's a whole new architecture that Jack's had to engage with to design our preview page and everything. And then there's the big question mark: is, are people going to see it? Are people going to find it within GameFound because it works so differently to Kickstarter? And that's an unknown. And we're at a point now where our next project feels actually riskier than the first one did.
That's quite interesting, isn't it? I mean, yes, GameFound, I guess, is not, well, it's rapidly gaining a lot of popularity. It's nothing like this established service that Kickstarter is. So why particularly did you want to move to it? You talked about the kind of ethical choice there. Did you feel that some of Kickstarter's decisions were such that you weren't very happy with them? What particular things motivated the move to GameFound for you?
So motivated the move was, so back towards the end of last year, Kickstarter came out with this announcement: we're moving to blockchain. And they came out with a nice long press release. And if you read through it and you take out all the waffle, it describes no benefits to creators or backers other than we're moving to blockchain. And obviously blockchain, now they're not talking about using like Bitcoin, for example, which is like the worst possible use of it. Well, actually NFTs might be up there. But there are certain blockchains which are hideously environmentally expensive. They do vast amounts of damage to the environment in terms of energy use and things like that. Now, they are talking about using CeLO, which is a different model of blockchain, which is less environmentally damaging, but still is damaging. And they say, oh, it's going to be carbon neutral through planting trees or whatever, which it's after the horse is bolted, really. They then came out with a follow-on like a month later, which said pretty much we're moving to blockchain. Again, no real benefits. They talked about how they would make it open source. It's like, well, there's plenty of tools already for making your code base open source. If you want to make your code base open source, put it on GitHub. Job done. You don't need to move to blockchain to do that. So we were very unhappy about that. We've run 4 Kickstarter campaigns. The last 3 of those have done pledge managers through GameFound, which I'm absolutely convinced is part of their business model to get people onto the crowdfunding when it becomes available. But that means almost everyone who's backed Flick Fleet has a GameFound account because they've done it through the pledge manager. And we're going there with an expansion for Kickstarter. So we asked the question probably a couple of years ago now, are you interested in the second expansion or the multiplayer one that we're thinking of? This was before COVID, I think, when we were hoping to do the multiplayer one next. During COVID, obviously, it's quite hard to get together when you live 100 miles apart and one of you is trying to be especially careful for health reasons. So we found it very difficult to play test anything multiplayer for a good year and a half of COVID. So that's been on the back burner for the last couple of years. But back then, it was by a country mile more popular with our backers than the thing that ended up being our best Kickstarter ever, and was followed by another thing similar to it, which was an even better Kickstarter. So I think there's a lot of interest from backers of previous campaigns for the multiplayer stuff, which is going to be part of Xenowars. So I think that's got potential. Our mailing list is like 5 times bigger than it was when we launched Kickstarter, and at least 20% bigger than it was when we launched our last campaign. And a lot of those people, judging by past performance, are likely to be interested in another expansion. The big question will be, will we get new people at the same rate through GameFound as we did through Kickstarter? I mean, obviously there are a lot more people are opening GameFound accounts because there are a lot more crowdfunding campaigns running on there right now. And some of those have been huge. I mean, there was one I saw this morning that had $1.8 million. There's been another one. I mean, there's been a lot of big campaigns on there. So it's building up a customer base of people with GameFound accounts who want to back games on GameFound. So I think there are reasons to be optimistic, but there are also reasons to be nervous. So we'll see how it goes. But I think we've got a decent chance. I think the fact we're not going there with a brand new game with no following, we're going there for an expansion, a standalone expansion, which can be played on its own 2-player or with the base game 4-player, 3 or 4-player. It's something that a lot of our backers have been asking for 2 or 3 years of the previous 4 campaigns. We've got a bigger audience that we've grown over the last 5 years. Fingers crossed, but yeah, exciting times.
Indeed. Well, best of luck with it. I hope it goes well.
Thank you.
Think it seems to be very much a growing platform.
Thank you.
So yeah, I think sounds to me like you've got a good chance of raising some good money on it. I would have thought.
Fingers crossed.
I see we're almost out of time. So we've been covering some of the listener questions already, I think, as we've been going, which is great. But I do have one here from Brainwave Games. And I think they were just very interested to know about the kind of history of Craft Wednesday, which is actually how I think Jack, discovered you first on Twitter, was through this and through the kind of prototype thing. I've participated a few times myself. There's a kind of every Wednesday people post pictures of their prototypes, and obviously as people who make things physically all the time. How did that come about?
That's a great question. I saw the question on Twitter when it was asked. I thought I've got to answer that question. It's going to be difficult. So my memory's terrible, which is a problem for this. So I think basically I just wanted to find people who liked making things like me in games. So I think I've been running it for 4 or 5 years. I don't know exactly when I started, but at the time I was making Zombology. So I was making a 108 card game in a tray and lid box, and I was cutting the box net out of Greyboard, folding, taping, labeling it with vinyl labels, folding a rule book, cutting 108 cards out of sheets of A3 card and putting them in a box. And so that's, and I mean, like Paul says, it's one of those Zen things. When you get in the mode doing it, it's like you're in flow. It feels very, very calm and relaxing. But I was interested in seeing what other people were doing and just sort of building a community around people who do those sorts of things. And an awful lot of it tends to be people talking about the prototypes of games they're working on. But it's not limited to that. We have people painting minis. We have people crafting their own minis out of Fibo. We have people making board game scenery, 3D printing, tabletop war game scenery, tables, game rooms. What else have we had? All sorts of crazy things. Household decorations based on board games, Christmas tree ornaments based on board games, all sorts of board game related crafting stuff. And it's really cool. You get to see some awesome stuff that people are making. And it's just sharing people's love of crafting game related things with the world.
Fantastic. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a wonderful thing. And I'm very intrigued to some of the incredible creativity that people have that you see just coming up through this feed.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's amazing. Some of this, the stuff that people do is just blows my mind sometimes. And some of it's so cool, and just the world needs to see more of it.
I remember someone baking Settlers of Catan tiles.
Baking them?
Yeah.
Edible ones? Oh my God.
Baking them to be edible. Yeah.
I think we've had edible Carcassonne tiles as well, actually.
Oh wow! But I remember the Settlers ones being absolutely. They just look amazing. They look like perfect 3D pieces, and then it's like, and you can eat it.
Yeah. Just a pity that the game only lasts once.
Game component upgrades.
Yeah.
There's all sorts of cool stuff people are coming up with. It's really cool.
Yeah, absolutely fantastic. Well, I just want to say thank you so much for joining me this evening. It's been absolutely brilliant to talk about it and understand a lot more about the behind the scenes of how Flick Fleet has come to be and all of those fascinating challenges that you've dealt with. So thank you very much.
Well, thanks very much for having us.
Indeed, thank you.
Producing Fun is produced by Naylor Games. If you enjoyed the show, follow us on Spotify, Stitcher, or other major podcasting platforms. Remember, Producing Fun is also a product, and it thrives on feedback. So please leave a review wherever possible, or simply send me your feedback directly. You can message me on Twitter @NaylorJames, or write me an email, james@naylorgames.com. Until next time.